All right, today I'm going to show you what I and over 2,000 others consider to be the best sourdough bread recipe. But the problem with making sourdough bread like this is that you need to add a lot of water to the dough. And when you add a lot of water to the dough, you end up with something that's very sticky, hard to handle, can be really hard to shape. And if you don't do things just right, you'll end up with a loaf that's really flat and squat in the oven. And nobody likes a pancake sourdough bread. To make this bread right, you need to know the right process and the right tips and tricks for handling a wet, high hydration dough like this. So I'm gonna show you exactly how I like to make this bread, all of the tips and tricks and process that I use to handle this kind of high hydration dough. And at the end of this video, you will be able to handle any high hydration sourdough bread recipe that you want to tackle. Let's get started. A levain is really just a pre-ferment. That means it's a little bit of your sourdough starter mixed with fresh flour and water and left to ferment for some time. I kind of like to think of it as a little offshoot to get your starter ready for a game day. To make your levain, you first want to have a small jar, and to that small jar, add 30 grams of your ripe sourdough starter, 30 grams of medium protein white bread flour, 30 grams of whole wheat flour, and 60 grams of water. I like to keep this mixture around 76 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, so around 25 degrees Celsius. That'll keep it nice and warm and ensure that you have a lot of activity in that levain before we mix it into our dough. Once you have everything mixed, just cover the jar loosely and set it aside for 5 hours. But before the 5 hours are up, we're gonna first mix our Autolyse 3 hours into our levain ripening. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix together all of the flour in the recipe and some of the water and just let that rest in a mixing bowl while our levain continues to ripen. So we're not going to use all of the water. We're going to use 650 grams here. We'll reserve the remaining about 100 grams until we do mixing later. To a mixing bowl, I just want you to add all of the flour. So we've got the white flour and the whole wheat flour all together. And to that, we're going to add 650 grams of water. What I like to do is just moisten my hand, pour the water, and then just use your hands to incorporate everything in the mixing bowl. So at this stage, all we're looking at doing is getting all of the flour hydrated. We're not looking to develop gluten in the dough or in the flour. All we're trying to do here is get the flour hydrated. I like to kind of just turn the bowl as I'm pinching the flour with my hand. Okay, now I have all of the flour hydrated, and really this dough at this point is just a sticky mess. We're going to let this sit covered for 2 hours while the levain continues to ferment, and in 2 hours then we'll use our levain and add it to this dough and begin mixing. All right, now we're at the third step in this process. We're gonna mix our dough. So our levain has been fermenting for 5 hours. It's super bubbly. You want to see bubbles on top and at the sides. It should have risen to some degree and maybe have even fallen a little bit. Really, you want to see a lot of fermentation activity in there, and that's going to be the seed for fermentation in our main dough. So that activity there is really what you're looking for. If it's not quite bubbly and you think it needs a little more time, give it another 15 minutes and check back again. Also, our dough in Autolyse. So we have the flour and a good portion of the water mixed together in the mixing bowl. This mixture should have gone for about 2 hours and should be ready for the rest of the ingredients to be added. What's awesome about the Autolyse technique, and the reason why I go for a 2-hour rest here, is that it reduces the amount of mixing that we have to do for this dough to develop the gluten. Gluten begins developing on its own, just kind of organically in this process. If you take a look at the dough, you'll notice that there is quite a bit of extensibility in it, and you really haven't done anything here. We haven't kneaded the dough or done any kind of mechanical mixing. Just by letting the dough rest, we can reduce the amount of manual mixing time that we have to do and still get a really developed and strong dough. In a little bit, I'm also going to show you what a poorly mixed dough or an underdeveloped dough looks like. So stick with me on that. You don't want to go there. So the first ingredient that I'm going to add to the dough is my levain. You should have about 151 grams of your pre-ferment. It's going to be everything in your jar that you mixed up earlier. If you don't have exactly 151 grams, it's okay, just do your best to get everything scraped out and onto the dough. Okay, now that I have my levain added to the dough, next up is the salt. And after the salt, I'm gonna add the held back water that we reserved from the beginning. We're gonna use this to wet our hands and kind of dissolve the salt and the levain into the dough and continue mixing. Don't add all of this reserved water, hold back a little bit. So we're gonna add about half Then assess the dough and see if it's strong enough so you can add the rest. If it's looking very shaggy, sloppy, and it's just not coming together, don't add the rest of the water, just hold that back. Your flour isn't able to take all of it, and that's totally fine. We always need to be aware of that and adjust for the recipe that we're working with. This is kind of a little trick. You just keep it in the bowl, and we're just gonna do a series of folds for 2 to 3 minutes as we rotate the bowl, and that's gonna develop and strengthen the dough all in the same bowl so we don't have kind of a mess on the counter. So you can see with my dough at this point, I'm done strengthening it. It's not gonna be so developed that it passes a window pane test, but the dough is very smooth. It kind of holds itself together. And if you tug on it, you've got some extensibility and elasticity. There's strength here in the dough, and it's smoother and holding itself together. Now that your dough is fully mixed, you can either leave the dough in this container for bulk fermentation or do as I do and transfer it to another bowl. Whatever your preference, it doesn't matter. Just be sure your dough is covered. Set a timer for 15 minutes and we'll come back and give it its first stretch and fold. Many bakers ask, how do I know if I've mixed the dough enough, or should I add all of the water in for this recipe? This is a dough that has had too much water added to it and it is essentially overhydrated. It would be very hard to salvage this dough with mixing because there's just simply too much water added. You see how the dough shreds and just falls apart? There's too much water added and it's almost like a pancake batter in here. The only way I would salvage this dough at this point is to add a little bit of flour at a time and continue mixing until the dough comes back together. All right, now we're into bulk fermentation. The dough's first dries. I secretly think that this is one of the hardest steps to making sourdough bread. That's for 2 reasons. The first one, it's hard to determine when the dough is strengthened enough and you can stop giving it stretches and folds. And 2, it's hard to determine when the dough has risen enough in bulk fermentation and you can now divide the dough. So specifically with this recipe, the bulk fermentation time is gonna be about 4 hours. So we're gonna give it 6 sets of stretches and folds, and that's kind of on the higher end, and that's because this dough has a lot of water. It needs more strength. We did a little bit of strengthening during mixing and we did a little bit with the Autolyse technique. Now we're gonna kind of finish it off with this bulk fermentation and stretches and folds. Uncover your dough, dip your hands in your water and reach down into the dough on 4 sides, and each side of the dough, we're gonna do a stretch and fold. So you reach down, stretch the dough up, fold it over. Rotate the bowl 180 degrees, stretch up, over. Now rotate 90 degrees. You can stretch up and over with these, or you can pick it up in the middle and let the ends fold in. Because this dough is so highly hydrated, I recommend doing a more vigorous set. And so what I do is I reach down, stretch up and over. And then I like to just kind of pick the dough up, organize it in the bowl, and then put the cover back on. So after you give it the first set a timer for 15 minutes, do another set, and then do one more after 15 minutes for the first 3 sets. Then set a timer for 30 minutes and do the remaining 3 sets spaced out by 30 minutes thereafter. Okay, this is my dough right before the 6th set of stretches and folds. You can see just how smooth the dough is. There's lots of air bubbles kind of forming inside, showing that there's strength for trapping those gases that are a byproduct of fermentation. And you can see that the dough is starting to dome down at the edge here, kind of where the dough meets the bowl. I'll probably give this dough one more gentle set of stretches and folds and then let it rest for the remainder of bulk fermentation. All right, it's been about 4 hours and my dough has risen considerably in the bowl. It's a lot smoother, and now I'm going to address that second challenge with bulk fermentation, and that is how to determine when your dough has risen enough and now it's time to divide. These are all the things that I look for. The first one, you can see there's little bubbles that are forming on the top and here at the sides. That's a good sign that there's been significant fermentation activity. And then I'm also looking for the edge of the dough where it meets the container. It's got kind of a nice downward slope. Also, if you shake the bowl a little bit, you'll notice the dough jiggles. Seems a little bit silly, but this shows that there's a lot of fermentation activity and the dough has risen enough that it's kind of aerated and looser even. Finally, you can wet your hand and you can just kind of pull the dough. You see how it comes off the side? That shows that the dough is smooth and strong. And again, this dough is ready to be divided. We're just gonna use our bowl scraper Dividing this dough is extremely easy. All we're gonna do is use our bench scraper to divide the dough directly in half. I like to use water to keep my hands and everything non-stick. Since this dough is a little bit slack and wet, it helps if you pre-shape the dough a little bit tighter than what you normally would. That's it. And for the second one, tuck the dough under, use this hand to keep it off the bench scraper, and then round and repeat. Now we'll leave this dough to rest for 30 minutes uncovered. For this recipe, I like to shape this dough into oval shape, and so I use a 14-inch long basket that I've dusted on some white flour to help the dough release from the basket cleanly. It's also important to use some flour on your hands and on the work surface to ensure that the dough doesn't stick. Because this dough is highly hydrated, I like to use my shaping method that uses a little bit more motions to kind of add structure to the dough. That will help the dough keep its shape all the way until you bake it in the oven. Now that your dough is shaped, you have one piece of dough in each basket. Cover the baskets with a reusable bag and stick them in the refrigerator overnight. So they'll continue to proof even though the temperature in the fridge is cool. And in the morning, we'll take the dough out and bake it straight from the refrigerator. All right, it's the morning and our dough has risen overnight. It's relaxed and spread out in the proofing basket in the refrigerator. Now it's time to bake. Put a small piece of parchment paper on top of the basket. Flip that stack over and now you'll have the dough resting on the parchment paper. Using a sharp blade or a pair of scissors, you can cut the top of the dough. I like to do a gentle curve and that kind of lets the dough open up into this beautiful ear on top. Once you have your dough scored, using the pizza peel or the cutting board, slide the dough with the parchment paper onto the preheated baking surface. Then very carefully throw the ice into the preheated pan at the bottom and close the oven door. We're gonna bake with steam in the oven for 20 minutes at 450 degrees. After 20 minutes, we'll remove that steaming pan and let the dough continue to bake for another 30 to 40 minutes at 450 degrees. The bread's done when the crust is really well colored, and if you have a thermometer to test, the internal temp of the dough will be around 204 degrees Fahrenheit. Remove the baked bread from the oven and let it cool on a wire rack for an hour to hour and a half. Honestly, being able to bake bakery level bread like this at home it's kind of ridiculous. The flavor is subtly sour. There's a lot of complexity. It really makes your mouth water. The crumb, the interior is melt in your mouth, super tender. And probably my favorite part is the crust, which is very thin, kind of crackly and crunchy. And really just being able to make this kind of bread in your home oven, it'll put a smile on your face every single time. I guarantee it.